war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression. However, no reasonable consensus was reached at the Rome Conference concerning the definition of these crimes. Their definition will be left to the arbitrary interpretation of ICC judges. There are other ICC problems as well. Judges, prosecutors, and counsel can be drawn from authoritarian regimes that are resentful of Americans. The ICC will recognize no right to a trial by jury, and certainly no right to a speedy trial. An American citizen, whether in or out of the U.S., could be accused of violating an undefined UN law. He would then be tried and convicted by foreign prosecutors and judges, then sent to some undisclosed prison somewhere in the world.
Most important, we should sign and ratify the Treaty for a Permanent International Criminal Court.
The majority of ICC supporters in government cannot risk showing their hand so openly. Initially, the Clinton administration objected to some of the provisions of the ICC statute and refused to sign. Political leaders expressed similar reservations. While some of this resistance was genuine, much of it followed a familiar pattern. Many politicians will often conceal their support for radical proposals by putting on an initial show of opposition. Eventually, these false opponents reverse themselves at a strategic moment, claiming a compromise has been achieved, and the public is led to believe that its interests have been protected. Eventually, the Rome Treaty was signed by Clinton, shortly before he left office. Ratification by the U.S. Senate is all that is needed for Americans to become victims of an ICC. If a UN-controlled world government is achieved, Americans can expect their lives to change dramatically. For example, population controls would go into effect in America. These controls include mandatory abortion, modeled after China's UN-funded one-child policy. To eliminate surplus population, euthanasia and assisted suicide would be promoted. Private and home schooling would be outlawed, as the UN takes control over all facets of education. New global taxes would also be imposed on Americans in addition to federal and state taxes. To transform much of the United States into wild lands habitat, millions of Americans would be relocated and miles of roads would be declared off limits. The very right to own property would be restricted and eventually abolished altogether. All law enforcement officers would fall under control of a global UN police force. Local police would exist to serve and protect the state, not the citizens. And the entire American military would fall under the command of the UN as part of the world's most powerful force, UN peacekeepers. Their prime objective? To suppress any opposition to the United Nations. If plans for a UN-controlled world government continue unchallenged, Americans will soon discover that their constitutional protections will be gone, that resistance to the UN is impossible, and that the once mighty America is unable to defend herself against an emerging totalitarian order. Opportunities to reverse America's course are abundant. Our constitutional system and cultural traditions continue to protect the freedom to speak out without fear of reprisal. And a giant advantage for the defenders of freedom is simply the desire to be free. At the same time, the internationalists fear an aroused and organized American public. They work to misinform and confuse so that the public won't know where to turn for real leadership. Leadership for effective opposition to the globalist agenda. Rather than cutting at the ever-expanding branches of UN programs, wielding a sharp axe to the root of the UN tree would assure a more permanent result. In this case, the root of that tree is United States membership in the UN. U.S. withdrawal would stop the UN's subversion of our nation and ultimately cause the UN to wither and die. Serving as the axe is the House of Representatives. It has the power to kill U.S. membership in the UN simply by refusing to fund any part of the UN program. A majority of 218 votes could effectively get us out of the UN. In 1997, the first measure calling for the termination of the United States membership in the United Nations came before the House. 54 representatives voted in favor. 2 years later, 74 representatives voted to cease all funding to the UN. At present, the remainder of the House lacks the backbone to resist the influence of the internationalists. The key to changing that condition, however, is taking place in communities across America. What is well understood by the internationalists is the power of organization. It's why they've invested so much effort building it. In turn, those who cherish freedom must also organize in order to maximize their impact.
And that's what this Carter Kit is designed for.
Vice President of the John Birch Society, Tom Gow.
Congressmen are focused on job security and getting reelected. And the Founding Fathers intended it that way when they set up the House of Representatives, to be responsive to the American people in their local communities. And the internationalists know that, and that's why they've invested so much time in trying to gain influence in the organs of mass communication so they can influence that public opinion. And it's very difficult for the congressman to fight that influence, fight the heat and the emotion that's generated in the nightly news and whatnot, unless they have some means or see a voice for sanity that's reaching their constituents. And that's one of the roles of the John Birch Society, or a primary function of the John Birch Society, is to provide that voice.
Informed constituent pressure is essential in order for Congress to sever UN ties. CEO of the John Birch Society, G. Vance Smith.
We have a great campaign. We have all kinds of tools. We have wonderful pamphlets that will really help people to understand what's going on. We have billboards, books, videos, all kinds of important things relative to this campaign, tools for this campaign. But those are not the campaign. The objective of the campaign is to change the individual, to help the individual understand how important their freedom is and the fact that they're going to have to do something about it. The only way there's going to be change is when the American people, individually, one at a time, wake up and do something. So our campaign is to empower people under organized leadership to work together to bring about this change. With that kind of pressure that they can put on the members of the House of Representatives, upon their own congressmen, they can bring about change. But there has to be a concerted action program.
Ultimately, the outcome is determined by the inspired action of individuals across this great land.
We really need the American people, while there is still time, to stand up for freedom and to stop the plans of the United Nations, and in fact to get us, the United States, out of the United Nations.